Okay, and this brings us to the fourth session in our conference, which involves very small rotation, as you can see. The section is about Ivan Fedorov and cultural exchanges in early printing. The pattern of this session will be very much similar to what we had before. So the first paper by Natalija Bondar, well, we have the English title here, the Russian title is Deiatel'nost Ivana Fedorova and Petra Mstislavtsa по reglamentatsii bogosluzhebnogo uchebnogo kharaktera. So I will read an English abstract. Ivan Fedorov's and Petr Mstislavets' work on the standardization of liturgical and study books. Over the course of several centuries, the publishing legacy of two Eastern Slavic book printers, Ivan Fedorov and Petr Mstislavets, mother of Fedorov, has remained under the purview of specialists such as historians of the book and bibliographers, as well as the broader intellectual sphere. Now, the activities of Fedorov and Mstislavets require a new interpretation, both due to a change in our intellectual climate and because insufficient attention has been paid to assessing what precisely the development of East Slavic printing owes them. On the one hand, there is an imperative to study the intellectual inheritance of Fedorov and Mstislavets. On the other, there are the well-founded fears of historians of the book that without new facts about these printers, any work about the printers will inevitably acquire a popular compilation. Quite a character of popular compilation. Due to the scarcity of sources and little likelihood of uncovering true sources, there is a necessity to study their work using new methods and approaches. Such studies can be of an applied character. For example, investigation into the watermarks on the paper of the printed books as a source of bibliohistorical study seems to be a promising way to learn about the kinds of paper used for book printing, the markets for purchasing paper, or the order in which parts of each run were printed, variations of the paper used, etc. However, a study of this relatively narrow topic demonstrated the necessity of works of a general character with a contemporary evaluation of the roles played by these printers on the European and world stage. There are several possible reasons for the bibliographical oversight of their roles. For Russian historians of the book, it was the assumption that these printers only continued the work begun with the printing of anonymous books of undeterminable origin. Also, there is no conclusive evidence suggesting that these anonymous books were printed in Moscow. In Ukraine, because it is very likely that there had previously existed, in Lviv in particular, a widespread Latin character printing culture. In Lithuania, they were overlooked due to the particular heterogeneity of Fedorov's and Mstislavets' books in the predominantly Catholic Latin Lithuanian society. In Belarus and Poland, Fedorov and Mstislavets were not seen as founders of the local Cyrillic printing tradition. The body of works printed by Fedorov and Mstislavets on the whole is well known. Thematically, they were mainly books intended for reading: the Acts and Epistles, the Gospels, the Book of Psalms, the Didactic Gospel, the Bible, the New Testament and Psalms, and the Book of Hours. Psalms and the Book of Hours and the Book of Hours. Among these were books that were frequently used for learning and teaching. First of all, the Book of Hours and Psalms, but also other textbooks in our modern understanding of this word, grammars and primers, or books for reading. The missionary and enlightenment roles of these printers' work is evident from even a cursory look at the editions printed by Fedorov and Mstislavets. The uniformity of structure in their work in different polities, despite significantly different political, ideological and religious factors, suggests a clearly designed, consciously selected printing program. On the whole, both of these printers, in contrast to their no less outstanding predecessors, Schweikhoff, Fios, Francis Scarina, were able to print Cyrillic books standardized in form and content, which united traditional characteristics of Orthodox manuscript books in with West European influence and other individual variations introduced by the printers. Their influence extended to creating printing types, ornamental designs, miniature engravings, and other layout decisions. Moreover, in a short time, their publications originally became part of the general flow of books to the various ethnic territories: Moscow, Zabluda, Vilnius, Lviv, and Ostrov. Specifically, these factors attest to the exceptional roles played by Fedorov and Mstislavets in his Slavic book printing as European and world caliber enlighteners, whose work requires study of various aspects of their legacy on the world stage, and particularly in a European and global context. That's the statement of Natalija Bondar. And our second speaker on this session is Professor Simon Franklin, who speaks about 3 types of asymmetry in Muscovite engagement with print.
I'm not really sure why I'm talking now, because I'm not going to talk about Fedorov, I'm not even going to talk about the 16th century, and I'm not going to say anything new. But I am picking up, as it happens, 1 or 2 general themes which began to glimmer in this morning's session of a rather broad nature in a kind of overview. The history of Russian printing is only part of the history of print in Russia. Histories of print in Russia tend to focus on local production, that is, on the history of Russian printing. However, no less important is the story of the Russian awareness of and uses of and cultural responses to material printed elsewhere. There's a curious and persistent, if irregular, pattern of asymmetries between the different aspects of Russia's engagement with the technology of print. The first and best known of these asymmetries is the mismatch between the patterns of the spread of print culture in Russia and Western Europe. The fact that knowledge of and availability of technology of print did not spark an equivalent print revolution in Moscow. That we're all aware of. The second asymmetry is the mismatch between local print culture and the engagement with the technology through its imported products. The chronology and repertoire of foreign printed materials, which not merely happen to have been available in Muscovite, but which were actively used, does not map neatly onto equivalent local production. We have to distinguish sharply between Russia as a producer and Russia as a consumer of print cultures. My remarks this afternoon focus mainly on a third kind of asymmetry, which is to some extent consequent on the second type. Russian engagement with imported print culture involved, more often than not, the reception of the product, but not of the medium. Again and again, in patterns repeated over the course of at least 200 years, we can observe a phenomenon which might be called technological reversal or reversion. The stimulus of input is West European and printed, but the local product or output reverts to manuscript. An obvious place to start would be the late 15th century, with the use of Latin and German printed books for the compilation of the Canadian Manuscript Bible of 1499. But for the sake of compactness and relative brevity, I'll focus on a later period, on 3 areas, just examples, of technological reversion in the mid to late 17th century. The 3 are arranged in sequence from the simplest to the most complex and nuanced. The first area of reverse technological transfer, and here I brazenly plagiarise a recent thesis by Clay Griffin, is medical knowledge. The institutional base was governmental, the Aptekarski Prikaz and the court. The intermediaries were Western medical practitioners in Moscow, the recognised sources and guarantors of their expertise were Western printed books. Foreign doctors figure in very early on in one of the foundational documents of Rus, the Petr of the Kiev monastery, as an Armenian doctor. In Muscovite, the more or less regular presence of foreign medical experts seems to date from the late 15th century, the institutionalization perhaps from the second half of the 16th century, that the records of the Aptekarski prikaz survive only from the 1620s onwards. From the mid-century, we know quite a lot about them, their origins, the requirements for their qualifications, and many episodes of their practice in Muscovite. Their authoritative knowledge, their input, was derived from the common West European repertoire of printed textbooks. These imported books form the basis of a medical reference library, because the medics were by and large self-contained, however, and isolated group. Their main job was to look after the health of the Tsar, his family and entourage, set apart also because of their working language, Latin. However, they weren't entirely sealed off from a wider audience. Practitioners of the prikaz were consulted in and provided written reports for witchcraft trials. They produced handbooks of pharmacological advice for the army, for some private patrons, perhaps also some texts of general medical advice for households. These were small, late, but not negligible signs of what Clare calls the Chancery's role in knowledge production in Lake Muscovy. Here, however, the relevant point concerns the medium of such knowledge production. While the input sources of knowledge, the Aptekarski prikaz, were printed, their outputs were entirely in manuscript, technological transfer with knowledge transfer with technological reversal. The transition to native print took place gradually in a sequence that can be traced over the full course of the 18th century. In Peter the Great's military hospital school, the books were imported. The quality of the library was noted by a Danish visitor in 1710. The instructors were foreign, the pupils were Russian, the mode of instruction was dictation, the language of instruction was Latin. By mid-century, medical textbooks had begun to be printed in Russia, but in Latin. No Russian original anatomical textbook was printed until 1801. That's a rather simple example. The second area of reverse technological transfer involves newspapers, also well known. The institutional base was again governmental, the Poselski prikaz and the court. The printed sources were West European newspapers. The manuscript outputs were the local summaries known as the Vesti Kurante. West European newspapers were brought to Moscow by Russian and foreign merchants and envoys at least from the early 1620s, possibly earlier. The first imports were occasional, but they became more frequent. From the late 1650s, the import of West European newspapers was in effect an official policy. In 1665, the establishment of a postal service via Riga enabled the Tsar to place an order for the supply of newspapers every 2 weeks. In the late 1660s, there were more or less regular deliveries of 9 German and 6 Dutch newspapers. So what does this unprecedented activity signify? Growing popular interest in current events in Western Europe, fed by the availability of and expanding demand for printed newspapers? No. The newspapers' points of origin were diverse and widespread, but in Muscovy they were narrowly channeled to a single destination for a single purpose: the government as sources of data for the use of the compilation of intelligence reports. The newspapers were translated at the Poselski prikaz, whose staff put together the digests. Just 2 manuscript copies were normally made, one for the Tsar, one for the Boyar Duma. Thus, on the one hand, it might seem that Muscovy was rather quickly alerted to one of the latest developments in West European print culture, newspapers originating early in the 17th century. Indeed, to one of the developments most conducive to making print culture popularly accessible. On the other hand, in practice, the products of imported print culture were once again translated only into local manuscript culture, and in this case into a manuscript culture so restricted, so exclusive, so inaccessible to any but the narrowest elite, that it seems the very antithesis of the original function of the Western source. The texts were imported, but not the technology, the purpose, the genre, or the spirit. The medium for the popularization of print was contextually filtered so as to become a medium for exclusive government intelligence. This is not merely a reversal of technology, but a complete inversion of function. It's no accident that when Peter sought to appropriate not just the information from the imported newspapers, but also some of their functions, he did so by adopting their technology, hence the printed Vernadsky. Such was the general case, though there are occasional glimpses of alternative perspectives and possibilities. An awareness of West European newspapers was not quite so tightly restricted as might be implied by their distillation into the Kurante. Muscovite officials with access to the Kurante did sometimes copy or commission copies of information which might be of interest. More intriguing, however, than the occasional leakage is a literary allusion to the genre itself. In 1647, the anonymous author of a Russian story of a polemic with Lutherans remarks, as if anticipating criticism for writing such a narrative, in foreign lands, Niemiecki, tales of military deeds are written and printed in books and on broadsides, na listach. Why are we slow, or afraid, or ashamed to write and print about what happens in the Russian land? The mention of Western printed listy with narratives of current events may be a reference to newspapers. If so, then not only do the anonymous author's remarks constitute a rare sign that Muscovite awareness of Western printed newspapers did spread beyond their immediate official users, they also provide a rare, perhaps unique example of explicit criticism of the restrictions imposed on such products of print culture in 17th century Moscow. The first two examples have an important feature in common. They relate to government activities, overseen and controlled by the Tsar and the relevant Prikaz. They represent top-down engagement with print cultures, where the state both required and restricted access to the primary printed input material. The third example is more complex, less self-contained, less neatly constricted, and in some ways more revealing. It involves the reception of biblical engravings and their labels or captions. The Muscovite engagement with West European printed pictures and printed ornament could be traced much earlier. Here I'm just focusing on one particular mid to late 17th century genre. The reception of such biblical albums differs from the reception of newspapers and of medical textbooks in that it was not limited to or controlled by any branch of government or indeed by any one institution. The phenomenon was far more diffuse and diverse, the influence far deeper, yet aspects are analogous, especially with regard to the phenomenon of technological reversion. The albums of biblical engravings associated with Nikolaus Johannes Fischer, Matthias Merian, Peter van der Borch, Peter Schuhl and others were in circulation and use at least from the mid-17th century. These were very substantial works, usually containing over 250 plates. They vary in format from Fischer's large folio editions, Merian in oblong quarto, somewhat cheaper, and so on. Until recently, Piscator tended to be used as the generic designation in Russian scholarship without differentiation between the various artists, engravers, and publishers. By the end of the century, imported engraved Bibles had become almost standard in any substantial private, monastic, or state institutional library in Russia. The abbot of one monastery even wrote his will in the margins of a copy of Piscator's Bible. Another wrote extensive autobiographical marginalia. A third interleaved the engravings with a manuscript chronographic text, creating a very large illustrated chronograph. Imported engravings played a key role in the process of the transformation of Russian practices of visual representation in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. They found an increasingly receptive audience of local practitioners and patrons willing to adopt and adapt their visual vocabulary and conventions. Around 1656 to 58, Iosif Vladimirov wrote a treatise on images, partly in the form of a letter to Simon Ushakov. Iosif was himself a painter of note and was also involved in the production of printed pictures. An engraving of an image of Christ Spasny Rukotvorny was printed in Vienna in 1663 from a drawing of his. Between 1660 and 1664 he worked at the Moscow printing house. 3 monograms on the press's engraved illustrations of the period have been identified as his. His treatise is a rare example of detailed Muscovite theoretical writing on religious imagery and is associated with the new trends in the mid-17th century. Specifically, after lambasting shoddy workmanship, he stresses the virtue of images which are lifelike, živopodobna, and points to positive examples from outside Russia, including the practice of drawing from nature and the admirable lifelike images which some foreigners produce in print. And at the point at which he mentions printed images, he also appends a list of engravings from Piscator's Bible. On the 5th of February 1685, Ivan Fedorov, who was in charge of the School of Painting at the Kremlin Armory, asked Petr to buy an engraved Bible for the school as a source of pictorial models for the students, Liturgical. The fact that Sheremetyev was quickly able to acquire a copy for 2 rubles implies reasonable availability on the market. Since Western engraved biblical imagery had penetrated not just into theoretical polemic and monastic libraries, but into the marketplace and even into the official Kremlin curriculum for students of painting, it's hardly surprising to find that their influence on late 17th century Russian religious imagery was widespread, almost pervasive. Western biblical engravings have been identified among the sources for icons and frescoes in several Moscow churches, as well as in Rostov, Kostroma, Vologda, Uglitch, and the most celebrated and well-studied examples of fresco cycles in Yaroslav. However, the creative engagement with Western engraved Bibles was not limited to painting. The responses were also written, even literary. Some of the engraved Bibles provided captions, which needed to be translated, others did not, and they needed to be supplied so that one knew what the picture was. Either way, Russian manuscript captions came to be produced for the imported printed pictures, turning the albums into print manuscript hybrids. The plainest versions of the Russian captions were simply explanatory prose, but the genre became aestheticized, so we also have verse captions. This is, by the way, an example of Miriam's Bible with Russian manuscript captions along the bottom for all the engravings. I'll leave it there for a moment. Verse cycles were composed by some of the age's leading literati. In 1679, Bondar, who worked at the Moscow printing house, wrote verse captions, some based on translations from Latin, others newly invented, to an edition of Piscato's Bible. A cycle of verse captions to Merian's engravings is attributed to Simeon Polsky. Both cycles broke free of the engravings which prompted them and were copied into manuscripts simply as continuous verse texts. In this form, they ceased to be verbal embellishments of the printed pictorial cycle. They became manuscript works of verbal display in their own right, part of the history of Russian belles lettres. So, the reception of imported albums of biblical engravings involves several different kinds of technological reversion. Their presence can be felt across all scales of painting, from miniatures to murals. They generated a new genre of Muscovite verse. They were adapted for the creation of new hybrids, whether interleaved as illustrations to Slavonic manuscript narrative text, or supplemented by handwritten captions in Russian. What about print to print? What was the reception of Western engraved Bibles in Russian print culture? The most immediate and fullest East Slav printed response to Western engraved Bibles was not in Muscovy, but in Kiev, Monastery of the Caves, where in 1645 to 49, the monk Ilya produced a substantial set of woodcuts for a Bible album comparable in scale to the Western versions, clearly modelled on Piscator or equivalent. The history of publication, however, and distribution is unknown. The few surviving copies, which are not complete and are hybrids, are printed on paper dated close to the end of the 17th century, so not contemporary with Ilya himself. In Moscow, the printed response to imported engraved Bibles was slower and more muted. Echoes of individual images appeared occasionally in the late 17th century as frontispieces or one-off book illustrations. There's a good example in the frontispiece to a collection of Simon Polsky's sermons published in 1681, with part of a narrative cycle clearly derived from Piscator. Individual illustrations are also reflected in some of the Russian engraved books, albums, block books and so on, that were starting to be produced from the end of the 17th century. Thematic cycles that draw heavily on Piscator around the turn of the century included 3 by Leon Zibunin. That is a series of 12 portraits of the apostles, his synodic, and a series on the Passion of Christ. However, the earliest known or surviving Russian suite of printed illustrations that are usually and somewhat misleadingly designated as the Bible owes little to the Western European prototypes. and that's the suite of just 36 woodcuts executed in the mid-1690s by Vasily Koyen. Its iconography is distinct, it's not of comparable scale, it's not really an engraved Bible as such. The first full translation and transfer of an engraved Bible was produced around 1720 by Dmitry Pastухov and Grigory Terchigorsky, who re-engraved Miriam and included integral Russian verse captions as part of each plate. So this set of engravings could also be said to contain the first printed edition of the verses from the biblical cycle by Semyon Polovsky. So, what does one learn from these three examples? I don't want to speculate here, though that can go into discussion, as to reasons for all these asymmetries in the Muscovite engagement with print. Rather than attempt a general conclusion, I instead point to just two rather broad lessons, which I think are reinforced by presenting the material in this particular combination. First, they underline the importance in the dynamics of printing in Russia, and this again is not new, of, to use an unfashionable phrase, control over the means of production. The church-state monopoly on local print production is an obvious factor in shaping the practical Muscovite response to the stimulus of print. Muscovite printing functioned under financial constraints, but not in real market conditions. This was perhaps the decisive filter affecting what passed from manuscript to print, from manuscript culture to print culture. However, in our three case studies, we see the significance of variables in another kind of control, not just over printed output, but over printed input. In two cases, medical books and newspapers, the state organised and maintained control over the supply. There was therefore a double filter, one which limited access to the printed input sources, and a second which limited the repertoire of local output. In the case of biblical illustrations, however, there was no such institutional blockage. The double filter did not apply. On the contrary, imported printed pictures were available in Moscow through almost normal market means, on open sale. This helps to account for the breadth of distribution and for the remarkable range and diversity of active responses to them in both visual and verbal culture. The second and more general lesson is that the agglomeration of such examples can serve to undermine some of the habitual generalizations about printing in Moscow. I come back in a sense to the start, that the story of Muscovite printing is only one part of the story of the Muscovite engagement with the technology of print. Indeed, the particularity of each, that is to say, Muscovite printing and the Muscovite engagement with print, is best explored through the dynamics of their relationship with each other. The asymmetries are a characteristic feature, deserve not to be explained away, but to be highlighted and confronted. They have a broader significance. They add both weight and nuance to the challenge posed by Muscovy to the somewhat technocentric generalizations about the impacts of printing derived mainly from the Western European experience. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you very much for the talk. I think this really brings to mind one question for me is this problem of that some printing was not profitable. It really had to be sponsored, or else someone was going to go bankrupt by it. Printing a Bible was not something that a private that one could really make a profit from. It had to be sponsored by a state or a patron. It was just too big, and the market was too maybe impenetrable. The work market, we see this in Ukraine. We see it in Germany because Gutenberg went broke, broke with his Bible. So some things were difficult to distribute by profit and commercial means and market means. It's understandable why those things would be subject to controls. But things like, as you say, these woodcuts, why wouldn't they be almost impossible to resist, for some enterprising printer, engraver, to make money distributing, woodcuts, individual pages. It doesn't have to be a whole illustrated Bible, but just single illustrations, or things like playing cards. Also, you know, these things that have popular appeal, that are relatively cheap, and that one could sell, you know, that for which there should be a pretty ready market. And yet I'm not sure we see that so much in, you know, we don't see anybody producing that in Moscow saying, oh, hey, look, these Lithuanian cards are, these cards from Lviv, these playing cards from Lviv are, you know, really going like hotcakes. I'd like to be a part of that, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the principal driver of the print revolution, the reason why by the end of the 15th century you have printing presses from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and right across Europe, except stopping at the borders, was not because they were producing big elaborate Bibles. It was because they were commercial jobbing printers who were producing the small things which people wanted to. They certainly weren't relying necessarily on individual patrons. It was producing things which individuals came and ordered, either making a profit that way, or things which they could sell, making a profit that way. But that was the only thing which kept. Pictures, of course, are easier because the labour is in the making of the woodcut or the engraving, but you don't need the elaborate letterpress print to do so. Engraving presses are a slightly different story. So yes, I mean, I'm agreeing with you. You just don't have commercial presses. They constantly complain of their constant difficulties in making production pay for itself, but that's quite different from a market. I mean, something I haven't talked about here is what there may or may not have been in terms of, it's been rather under the radar, the small-scale production of non-books in Russia, and I think there was considerably more than we can see, but not enough to make it into a commercial operation. The import and spread of Western printed pictures on the markets, of course, predates and is more substantial than the production and spread of printed pictures locally. However, the production and spread of local pictures is already, well, it's pieces perhaps of the late 16th century, basically it's the late 17th century beyond phenomenon, and certainly it's a much freer market in ways which are peculiar, because here are in some ways very undermining sorts of images, but there seems to, one has polemics over whether they were acceptable or not, but they seem to have made no difference in the distribution. So it's an elaborate way of saying, yes, I agree with you.
Just a quick little question. Does that mean that booksellers were not, it's like the distribution seems to be the problem. Booksellers or people who sold other things but then also had books, peddlers, or is this the problem, do you think?
Well, distribution is an issue. I mean, we know where books and prints were sold in the Moscow commercial rows and in stalls outside the Kremlin and so on. But you've got to have something to distribute. And who had the presses? And who told the presses what to print? Did people from the Muscovite Dvor go up there and say, hey, who wants to pay us to print something? No. Did they say, do you know what we can go and what can we go out and sell? No. There was a top-down process of telling them what to print, and they damn well had to make it pay. And sometimes they underproduced, so they could keep producing the book variety, and that was fine. You know, the major biblical products, the first complete printed Moscow Bible, 1663, print run, was it 1200 or 2400? One or the other. But anyway, it was certainly distributed, but there was the next one wasn't produced until the 1750s. And there were plenty still lying around. They didn't, you know, because once you had it, it was there. It was not a consumable, and you'd actually need a full Bible anyway. So I think that it's not just the distribution issue. It's if you had a market, the distribution would take care of itself.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes, I mean the one partial exception to this, and it's partial both geographically and temporally, is the press of the Marmonici, who are the one really significant commercial East Slavonic printing house. And they would print absolutely anything. They had no religious convictions, whatever, as far as I can see. But as far as Muscovite is concerned, they were only an active ingredient in the scene until the middle of the 1620s, when the Muscovite government, evidently feeling that it could now fulfill its own requirements, began to take active steps against the import of Lithuanian books. Up to that time, it had been quite encouraged, and you have these things appearing for sale in Moscow within a year, the same year as they were published. So the Marmonici, who, as I said, printed absolutely everything in any language that they thought they could sell. I mean, I think one of the reasons why they quarrelled with Petr Mstislavets is that they had a very different attitude to book production. The Marmonici were purely commercial, whereas Mstislavets was wanting to produce beautiful, high-quality books of the sort which you can see an example next door, but which were not profitable. This is, as far as I can see, the only example of commercial book production in the East Bulgaria.
And I was careful to say I was talking about the Muscovite.
Yes.
So I agree with you there. And in a sense, Fedorov himself, if one has to say something about Fedorov to justify being here, I mean, when he left Muscovite, he had a much more typical life of one kind of Western printer. That is to say, not a jobbing printer producing whatever the market would bear, but at least working for a sequence of patrons, basically. Whether he produced more, I mean, he did produce one of the very, 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 very few kind of individual bits of commission production we have from Fedorov, or from anyone, before the 18th century, before the second half of the 17th century, is his single sheet calendar with the verses of Rimsha. What's his first name? Andrei Rimsha, exactly, yes. So perhaps he produced, I mean, Nimirovsky, is convinced he produced a lot more than that, and that's perfectly possible, because these things survive by accident. And he, outside Muscovy, was much more of a West European style of presentation.
Thank you very much. And I was thinking about your last example, which is on visual culture.
Yeah.
So it didn't change the sort of the visual culture in Muscovy. But I was just thinking, can we speculate, was it not enough sort of input and engagement with Western visual culture, or was it the other way around?
Well, it did in all sorts of ways change Muscovite visual culture. I mean, one can see the very clear visual presence of these engravings throughout late 17th century Muscovite visual culture. And indeed, I mean, it was mentioned briefly this morning that the impact of Western engravings on aspects of visual culture goes back a great deal earlier. I mean, even the beginnings of what one calls, as I'm sure you know, uchebnogo. The passage is very strange. It's from Western printed books into Slavonic manuscripts, into then sort of double-dotted lines, so to speak, going into Slavonic printed books. But it's again, it starts off with something in print being picked up in manuscript and then recycling around it to print. So and of course, visual culture, you don't have the problem of translation, the problem of words and language, and people can interpret them as they choose rather than being sort of offended by unfamiliar words. But no, so late 17th century Muscovite imagery is hugely affected by imported printed imagery.
And just to follow that, even in the time of Fedorov and Ivan Fedorov, we
The
have the illustrated chronicle compilation, which is full of practically rather crude reproductions of Western prints.
And your favourite image on Ivan's great banner also has sort of Western-based apocalyptic imagery and so on.
A really ignorant question.
It's the worst kind.
That's the first
I
answer.
believe that that for a second. Yes.
One is, what was the nature, if any, of musical notation at this time? That's one question. And the other, what was the origin and distribution of the lubok, and when did it take place?
Oh, two very simple questions.
Yes.
Musical notation, I'm sure there are people who know much more about musical notation than I do, but musical notation on lines, I think is late 17th century in Russia. Yeah.
For Muscovite, very late.
In Muscovite.
And in Rus, much earlier.
But late 17th century. Yeah, late 17th century.
So it was oral transmission up to that time, teaching in the...
well, no, you have manuscript musical notation going right back to the Kondakari of the 12th century.
Right.
In neumes of various kinds. But if you're looking at music on lines,
Right.
that's late 17th century. And then we come to the origin of the lubok. And what you mean by the lubok. But no, if you're talking about individual, I mean, one can probably find individual religious images, because lubok starts off as religious imagery, even from the end of the 16th century. But as a continuous tradition, it's very difficult to trace it back earlier than the second half of the 17th century. And certainly if you're looking at lubok books as in block books, engraved books, again that's late 17th century onwards. There's an issue which, again, other people will know much more than I do. Who printed all these things? And that is not straightforward. There's some, one should Skype in Prof, who's produced a nice big book, well, two books on a really good album of lubok, with about as much information as one could hope to find. Unfortunately, I hope the library has it. Very expensive.